Welcome everyone, and thanks for watching. After the positive reception to my Ecosphere build last league, I'm thinking about continuing to make videos for my most successful builds. I'm a mechanics nerd, and the whole reason I play is to see ridiculous interactions combine into shockingly viable builds. So, in each of my builds I'll focus on a surprising interaction or an underestimated mechanic, and walk through the process of pushing it to the limit. In this case, the meta caught on before I was able to put this video together, but that limit may be more literal than expected. With what turns out to be the highest DPS Ignite spell in the game, we'll be flying past the dot cap with my Warchief Ignite Elementalist. I'll be showcasing endgame encounters and bosses after explaining the build, so you can use the video chapters to skip ahead if that's what you're looking for. For now though, let's begin with the mechanics. Elementalist Ignite is a build I've used at League Start a couple of times, but I always look for a new skill to base it on. Before we get to the jank, you might appreciate the process I use to identify viable Ignite spells. If we can understand the damage scaling that each spell has access to and the opportunity cost associated with them, we can directly compare them. The results might surprise you, but let's make sure we understand the options first. If a hit ignites, either by critting or having chance to ignite, the Ignite's DPS is derived from the hit's base damage, which comes after flat damage is added and damage types are converted or gained as other types, but before increased and more damage multipliers are applied. The best way to add flat damage is generally through gem levels, with options like Skin of the Lords, Dialas, or Bronze, because base damage scales exponentially with level, and that damage can benefit from the same conversions as the rest of the skill. Speaking of conversion, only fire damage from the hit contributes to the Ignite DPS by default, but several options exist to work around that, including Shaper of Flames from Elementalist, which lets us add damage of any type for our one big hit. All Ignite damage scales with burning damage, but the contribution from each damage type also scales with any modifier to that type and types it passed through in the conversion chain. So, if a player with Shaper of Flames hits with base cold damage and converts 50% of cold to fire, the Ignite will benefit fully from modifiers to cold damage, because all of the damage passed through cold in the chain, and will benefit fully from modifiers to fire damage, because the Ignite deals burning damage, even if it was based partially on cold. This means that a great way to scale base damage is to convert through multiple damage types, using gain as extra mods to multiply the damage and benefit from damage scaling at each stage. Hatred is a perfect example for physical spells when converting to cold, effectively offering 48% more damage. And options like Gloomfang or Atziri's Promise encourage conversion through multiple damage types, as the extra chaos is gained at every stage of the conversion. After base damage and increased damage modifiers, there are a few damage scaling layers that all spells have similar access to, including Damage Over Time Multiplier from the passive tree and weapons, Ignite Steal Damage Faster from the tree or replica Emberwake, increased enemy damage taken from shock or covered in ash, and reducing enemy fire resistance through things like exposure, curses, combustion, and Eye of Malice. There are also two major conditional damage multipliers. Aside from niche perfect agony builds, most spells with a chance to crit will use elemental overload, although its uptime is usually overestimated. More on that in a minute. The other is the final part of Shaper of Flames, which encourages conversion to fire. Even partial conversion is enough, as the check for whether fire is highest is based on the enemy's damage taken, accounting for things like their lowered fire resistance and increased fire damage taken. Even spells which use Gloomfang and gain more chaos base damage than fire can benefit for that reason. But now, with all these tools at our disposal, the main difference between potential Ignite spells are the base damage values and type, built-in multipliers, and notable alt quality effects, which can be scaled with Enhance or Ashes. With a healthy dose of conditional logic and permutation analysis, we can now properly evaluate our options. I do love a good spreadsheet, and this is a chunky one. Here's the idea. We can start by recording the base properties of every spell in game. Everything from base damage to conversions, additional resource pools to quality effects, and built-in damage multipliers. We can also enumerate the value and availability of various stats on the passive tree, which each permutation can choose from. We can then calculate intermediate values for each damage scaling stat, with a basic gear setup automatically determined for each spell based on its properties. And from those intermediate values, we can determine damage multipliers achieved with the best selection of support gems, passive tree points, damage conversion scaling, auras, and elemental overload uptime, which is based on crit chance and the estimated hits per second. A few additional gear permutations enforce the use of quality boosting tools like Ashes, Enhance, or Dialas, because the quality effects are incorporated into the intermediate stats. Alternate qualities like Divergent Flame Dash were manually chosen over basic qualities, so this gives them a chance to shine. And finally, by aggregating the highest result from each permutation, we can get a ballpark for the top-end Ignite DPS potential of every spell. These numbers don't account for enemy resist reduction or utility skills like Flame Surge, so they aren't true DPS numbers, but all spells can use those to the same effect, so these numbers will let us compare them. The results confirm the strength of some of the most popular Ignite spells, like Fire Trap, EK, and Death Wish, which tops the chart for previously available builds. We can also see a handful of surprisingly viable spells, like Exsanguinate, Freezing Pulse, and Reap, which actually competes with Death Wish for the top spot with the new buff from Val Reap. That being said, these are best case numbers which don't consider the clunkiness of each spell. Scaling Freezing Pulse to that degree would require standing point blank and chaining off a Hydrosphere with Gloomfang, so keep that in mind. The real shock in all this is the newly arrived Totem skills. Obviously, Decoy and Devouring Totem can't even hit enemies by themselves, but that's alright, we'll just have them explode. I got pretty excited when the Crucible patch notes said they'd finally be improving Phantasmal Decoy Totem's behavior. Previously, the Totem's explosion belonged to the Totem, just like the explosions from minion instability, which belong to the minions. In the minions case, this is fine, because you can scale minion damage through support gems and the minion damage stat, but totems are not so simple. Totem builds don't actually scale their totem's damage. They scale player damage because totems generally use the player's skill on their behalf, benefiting from the player scaling instead of their own. Decoy Totem's explosion was a notable exception to this. Belonging to the totem instead of the player meant that it was unscalable by player stats. And support gems linked to totems are actually modifying the skill being used, which belongs to the player, rather than modifying the totem itself. Not that it even mattered, because support gems linked to Decoy Totem were affecting its taunt ability, not the explosion, so any support which required the skill to hit or deal damage couldn't even link. I assumed that the patch would be making the explosion belong to the player and be used by the totem just like regular totem skills, making Decoy Totem a viable Ignite skill. If they also made the explosion part of the totem's skill effect, which could accept support gems, it'd be the strongest Ignite in the game. But what we ended up with is something much stranger. Totem explosions now belong to the player, but they are not used by the totem, so they can benefit from all of your damage scaling, as well as on-kill effects like Barracks Respite, a welcome bonus. Although this contributes to the inconsistency of explosion mod behaviors. Enemies killed explosions, such as Profane Bloom, belong to whoever gets the kill. Minion Instability's explosions belong to the dying minion, and now totem explosions belong to whoever summoned the totem, despite all having similar wording. Since the explosion is still not part of the totem's skill, it still can't be affected by support gems. This means Decoy Totem is in the running for Ignite skills, but it's nothing crazy, and it has a 4-second cooldown, so you still need an extra clearing skill. But luckily, there was something even stronger left out of the patch notes. The new Crucible weapon trees include a node that grants 25% reduced totem life in exchange for a massive 600% totem explosion. Even with Phantasmal Decoy Totem in a Diala's chest with Enhance and Ashes, its explosion would only reach 240%. Using this node instead means we can use any totem for the explosion, including Devouring Totem, which has the same large increase to totem life, but without the cooldown, and with a quality that further increases totem life. But why stop there? Like minions, totem life follows monster-level life scaling, with a multiplier that is specific to each totem type. Every existing totem has a multiplier of either 100 or 120%, with one exception. Val Ancestral Warchief has an absurd life multiplier of 744%, dwarfing the competition in potential Ignite as it approaches 4 times the DPS of Death Wish. The fact that it's so limited in support gems and quality scaling actually make gearing much more approachable, but we'll touch on that in a moment. For now, we need to deal with the fact that Val skills require souls and have soul gain prevention timers that could compromise our Ignite uptime. Vol Ancestral Warchief has a soul gain prevention timer of 9 seconds by default, which is increased to 13 because of some unfortunate totem duration on our totem life nodes. Ignites only have a base duration of 4 seconds, and our faster Ignite stat brings that down to 3, so we'll have to bridge the gap. Thankfully, the Defiled Forces node can constantly refresh the duration when combined with a reliable source of curse application. Arcanist's brand is definitely the highest DPS method on paper, as it can apply curses with no penalty while also triggering other spells. But it has a few issues. It only casts a linked spell once a second, so it takes a few seconds to apply all the supporting effects. It has a base duration of just 3 seconds, so it needs to be recast often, and you have to pay the mana cost every time it triggers a spell, which can really add up for curses. Instead, I opted to use Stormbrand with Hex Touch, which has a tiny upfront mana cost, a 6-second duration, and applies both curses and the combustion debuff instantly. So, as long as we get one Vol Warchief to pop, the Ignite will extend until the boss dies or phases. Now, Vol Warchief requires only 20 souls per use, and the regular Warchief totem is enough to easily clear maps, so having souls up for the boss is no concern. Even Guardians and Conquerors go down in one hit after the map, but Pinnacle bosses have no map to collect souls from, or have invulnerability phases which drop the Ignite. For the endgame encounters that deserve it, we can switch out our flasks, dropping armor flasks in favor of a Soul Ripper with just over 40 max charges, and using the Traitor Keystone provided by Brutal Restraint in the name of Balbala. With a couple flask slots empty, the Traitor can generate the charges for Soul Ripper during the grace period before a fight, granting enough souls for 2 uses of the Vol Warchief. In boss fights with rapid invulnerability phases or multiple targets, like invitations, I instead switch Warchief for Devouring Totem, which has half the damage but more consistency. Either way, we have a massive physical damage hit to work with, so we can use the tools I mentioned earlier to scale the Ignite. For many of the high damage spells in the spreadsheet, optimal damage is achieved with lots of gem levels by combining Skin of the Lords with Empower. Skin grants 2 levels to the spell, around 24% more damage, and 2 levels to Empower, turning it into a 72% more damage support on average, at least until you hit level 30, where the damage multiplier per level is halved. Unfortunately, thanks to the breach changes, Skin of the Lords with usable colors and a keystone which doesn't brick the build cost upwards of 8 divines at the moment, plus another 5 divines for level 4 Empower, and around 25 divines on Ashes of the Stars for spells that need the quality. It's now more expensive than ever to put these together, but we have a great alternative with totems. Since support gems don't affect the explosion, Empower and Enhance were the only reasonable links for Ignite anyways. Instead of paying a fortune for the chest and wasting 2 links, we can slot it in a Crest of Desire, which adds 8 gem levels and up to 50 quality, even more than the skin's 7 levels and 40 quality. We lose the helmet slot for Eye of Malice, but we free up a 6 link for support skills, and it only costs a divine. Thanks to PoE Ninja, we can see that with a bit of hustle, I was able to begin converting my Vol Reap Ignite League starter at the end of day 1, grabbing the first crest on the market. By day 2, I was off to the races with all the core gear pieces. I've since changed a few pieces around though, so let's take a look in-game. Vol Ancestral Warchief in Crest of Desire is the core of the build, and I've taken the cold conversion route to benefit from gain as extra modifiers. Conversion on the tree and gloves gets us most of the way there, and can be finished off with a Watcher's Eye, while Taste of Hate and Hatred add a bunch of extra cold. Hatred is linked with a Blessing setup, with reduced cost from Divergent Divine Blessing, Divergent Inspiration, and Anomalous Increased Duration to make room for Herald of Purity and Malevolence. Since we can't use Cold to Fire support, Pyre is here to convert to fire and let us benefit fully from Shaper of Flames, along with a large burning damage roll. Barracks Respite offers screen-wide clear for most mapping situations, but for endgame bosses, I use a second Pyre, along with Adziri's Promise to complete the conversion to fire and gain extra chaos damage from every step of the chain. To further boost Ignite damage, I'm using a handful of support skills, including the Stormbrand setup with Curses and Combustion, Infernal Cry to cover enemies in Ash, and Flame Surge for stationary targets. Fire exposure is granted by any hit, thanks to a glove implicit. Now, our damage scales with increases to totem life, and we start at a deficit because of the Crucible node. So, I've taken every opportunity to grab increased life from the tree, jewels, an ironwood anoint, and the torch oak step boots, which have a healthy dose of placement speed as a bonus. And while it may be harder to come by now that the poison trap-based totem explosions have been popularized, a strong ignite staff like this, with lots of dot multi, increased damage, and damage as chaos can add a lot for the build. Most of these pieces still have room for improvement, with a +1 amulet, an improved Crucible tree, and more, but I had more than enough damage for a starter, so let's review the admittedly mediocre defenses. If I was a responsible gamer, I'd recognize that just over 125 million peak DPS on Pinnacle bosses means that we've just passed the dot cap of 35 million on Uber bosses, even after their 70% damage reduction. Since I never really do Ubers, it would be sensible to cut some of that damage and build in more tankiness. But what can I say? The numbers got the better of me. The defenses aren't incredible, but I did make a fair effort, and it's taken me through all the content in the game, including all of the Pinnacle bosses and invitations like the Feared. To start with, I'm using Purity of Elements to help with resists and achieve elemental ailment immunity, and I'm using armor as my defensive base, with Determination, flasks, and base armor from every gear piece. I'm converting over 60% of physical damage taken to Cold and Lightning with Taste of Hate and Lightning Coil to increase the effectiveness of that armor, which gets to act against smaller physical hits. A cast when damage taken guard skill rounds things out, but clearing packs off-screen is probably the most significant defensive layer for the build, making for a very smooth playstyle. Scaling Ignite is all about creating one big hit, but that can often come at the expense of responsiveness or screen coverage. Because of that, it's important to use one of the two tools for spreading ignites around. Ignite Proliferation is one popular and widely accessible option, found on support gems, cluster jewels, and glove implicits. It causes any ignite you inflict on an enemy to also burn enemies around them. This has the major benefit of continuing after the enemy dies, as long as their corpse remains ignited. But it won't propagate off-screen, as enemies around simply take the burning damage. They don't become ignited themselves. Ignite Spreading, on the other hand, as offered by Barracks Respite and Abrath's Hooves, causes the ignite on a dying enemy to be inflicted on nearby enemies with whatever duration remains. This doesn't have the lingering effect of proliferation, and it doesn't start killing nearby enemies until the first one dies, but with a significantly powerful ignite, it can propagate through packs and clear entire screens. Unfortunately, these two effects don't work together, as Ignite Proliferation prevents Ignite Spreading from occurring. I opted to use Barracks for my build, as I find it smoother and more satisfying, but both are viable. While clearing, things are simple. Since we have a totem limit of 1, we can spawn a Warchief totem by each pack as we run along. With each totem we place, the previous totem explodes, igniting and clearing nearby enemies. On tough maps, we can hit our Hatred Blessing once every 20 seconds or so for a big boost in damage. For tough single targets or bossing, we pull out the big guns. Making sure that Hatred Blessing is up, we drop a Vol Ancestral Warchief beside the enemy, but it has a built-in totem limit of 2, so regular Warchief totems will never replace it. Instead, we can use either Searing Bond or Rejuvenation Totem linked to multiple totems twice to replace the Warchief. Once the Ignite is going, we can apply the brand and start dodging. Infernal Cry and Flame Surge are only really necessary for the strongest enemies. And for bosses which have a grace period or entrance animation, it's easy to preload the buffs, flasks, brand, and totems, leaving just the final rejuvenation totem for when they become active. Even with their initial damage reduction window, the damage is enough to flatten most of the endgame. All in all, the build has been thoroughly satisfying to play and has handled everything I threw at it, but it's really been a great exercise in optimization. The Ignite spreadsheet that revealed its strength taught me a lot about opportunity cost, damage conversion, and gem level scaling. And as a living document, it can essentially solve the new Ignite meta each league by simply plugging in the new gem numbers from patch notes, at least in terms of damage. For those who don't care about playing the most optimal skill, it also reveals a number of underestimated Ignite spells to have fun with. I, for one, now have a healthy supply of off-meta skills for next league. Beyond the main skill data, the various pages of the spreadsheet are linked in a way that make them fragile to modification, but I'll include a link to the sheet in the description for anyone to review. So, as a number of other creators are already showing, the power of the Totem Explosion mod is a bit absurd. Hitting the dot cap on Uber bosses is not something I expected from my League starter. I'm obviously still new to the video making process, so I'm a bit late to the party, despite having had it up and running on day one. But either way, I hope you enjoyed this slightly different take and the new Ignite prospects. If you thought this showcase was cool, share it with a friend who might like it too. I have a handful of promising jank ideas to explore in Crucible League, so we'll see if any pan out. Until then, have a good one.